The cruelest twist? The man who used her was the first man who actually stayed. Pause right there because this story is evil in the smartest way possible. She hires a man to fake devotion only to find out he chose her on purpose because she was his shortcut to revenge. That should be the end, right? Wrong. Because while her uncle treats her like family property and her ex crawls back only when it's too late, the liar in the black suit is the one who stands between her and a loaded gun. So who's the villain? The uncle who broke her? The man who used her? Or the truth that she loved him after learning everything?
She was entirely unaware that she had just stepped onto a battlefield crafted for a war of the mind. The strategy was meant to be elegantly vicious, secure a stand-in date for the wedding of her cousin to her own former love. It was a gambit for control, a public declaration that she had moved on, designed to silence the family's endless scrutiny. But the man who appeared was not the one she had commissioned. Her fatal error, the instant the entire play was rewritten, was her failure to send him away. Something in his presence simply seized her rationale, the weight of his gaze, the quiet command in his posture, an authority that crushed her common sense. She agreed before she could think, and with that, the true snare was set, the unchosen one. Tucked in her pocket was a pristine contract, the last thread holding her sanity together. Every official detail, the letterhead, the fluid signature, a 2-part payment with the deposit already cleared, formed a paper-thin fortress of her own making. This was her counteroffensive, a meticulously planned act of defiance against her family's judgment, the very heart of this entire charade. Amber light spilled from the club's entrance as the bass pulsed against the window pane. She straightened her dress, steadied her breath, and donned the mask her mother once called a queen's face with a spine of steel. But that verse was a fragile illusion, not true armor. She was held together by sheer will, far from the cold numbness she craved. The detonation had occurred a week prior, an elegant ivory invitation bearing the initials G and C, Ginebra Ferrante and Connor Reed. His name triggered a system failure so complete it left her on the floor for nearly 2 minutes before she blindly reached for the solace of wine. Connor Reed, the man she had loved for 18 months, was marrying her cousin. The absence of a sharp, clean wound was the most twisted part of it all. The true injury was a slow corrosion, a quiet, sustained assault from her uncle Augusto and her cousin, whose most devastating verdicts were always delivered in silence. They had penned her into the role of the collateral niece, the child of the sister who had abandoned the fold, a brand that forever kept her on unsteady ground. The objective tonight was to radiate absolute power, not to plead for acceptance. That contract was her entire script. Her gaze scanned the lounge for her hired asset, tall, dark hair, gray suit, the name Felipe. A man at the bar fit the profile. That had to be him. But 3 steps forward, he rose, he turned, and the world around him dissolved into shadow. Leaving only his form in stark relief, he commanded the room without effort. His suit, the precise shade of a night with no stars. His eyes were already on her, an unmistakable signal he had found his target. Her body went into a state of emergency, a primal reboot that completely bypassed conscious thought. The man in the dark suit closed the distance between them, inclined his head, and a low, resonant voice spoke her name. Serena? It was a declaration, not an inquiry. Matteo Romano, I am your companion for the weekend. The agency sent a confirmation, Matteo declared, his tone extinguishing her question about Felipe before it could even form, carrying an air of finality. A last-minute substitution. He delivered this news with such chilling self-possession that for a fleeting moment she did not even think to challenge it. Her phone was a useless weight in her purse, buried alongside her dignity and her meticulously laid plan. No such confirmation had reached her. She could have resisted, could have aborted the entire operation, but she was simply too weary for another battle. For once, she yearned for something to unfold without a fight. He was an unknown, but the pressure was crushing. The wedding, an uncle who viewed her as a blemish on the family legacy, and a cousin marrying the man she had spent 18 months of her life with. She had no energy left for a plan B. "Are you familiar with the arrangement?" she asked, her voice a faint echo of authority. Matteo Romano observed her with a stillness that was deeply unsettling. "To escort you to the wedding and ensure no complications arise. And to convince my entire family that my life is an unequivocal success." "That is included in the service," he replied, a shadow of a smirk in his voice. Her knuckles whitened around her clutch. "Then let us proceed." The car was a silent chamber, thick with the scent of expensive leather and another fragrance that was about to be seared into her memory. Matteo drove with one hand, possessing the fluid ease of a man perpetually in command, not because his world was peaceful, but because he was a master of concealing the storm within. She gazed out the window, projecting a disinterest she was far from feeling. The journey to the Ferrante mansion was over an hour. She spent the first 20 minutes constructing a mental bastion of rationalizations. This is a transaction. A contract exists. The man at the wheel is not the man I hired, but the function remains the same. She recited this litany like someone adjusting paintings to ignore the spreading cracks in a wall. Service rendered, wedding endured, family silenced. The fantasy of simplicity was her only shield. Her phone vibrated. It was Isla, her best friend, a connoisseur of vicarious panic. "You have him? What is he like? I require a photograph. At once." She hazarded a look at Matteo. His focus was fixed at the road, his expression a perfect blank. "They sent a replacement," she typed back. "It is not the original arrangement." 3 dots pulsed for what felt like an eternity. What is that supposed to mean, Serena? She put the phone away before her friend's inevitable crisis could provoke a laugh. "Is your family large?" Matteo asked, his voice suddenly cleaving the quiet. The abrupt question disoriented her. It took a moment to answer. "The kind that measures its worth in drama, not members." The corner of his mouth shifted upward. It fell short of a true smile, yet it was the first fracture in his stoic facade. "And the groom?" he inquired, his tone as neutral as a weather report. "He is my ex." I allowed that truth to hang in the space between us. Matteo was silent for a long moment. "Finally, I see." "Understanding is not part of the agreement," I countered. "Appearing utterly captivated by me is—" His gaze cut to me for one sharp, appraising instant before returning to the road. "That will not be a problem," he said, and the conviction in his voice sent a tremor through my stomach that I consciously chose to ignore. I watched Matteo Romano drive, enveloped in that unnerving calm, his silhouette defined by fleeting streetlights, and I concluded that for the seismic disruption his presence would unleash upon my family, he was worth the expense. The calculation I had yet to make, the devastating truth that would remain concealed for far too long, was that he knew my identity before I ever entered that club, that the name Serena Ferrante was already familiar to him, that this substitution was entirely deliberate, and that the man beside me knew precisely who I was, who my family was, and had a very specific purpose for that knowledge. I stared at the approaching estate lights, aware only of the contract's weight and the silent, potent heat radiating from a man who was far too close, who breathed far too deeply, and whom I had just invited into my life. Chapter 2. Arrival at the Estate. Serena. Music. The Ferrante estate was a monument to quiet, suffocating power. Its iron gates parted with a slow, theatrical gravity, as if to announce the significance of your arrival, and the long, jacaranda-flanked drive drew one's gaze inevitably to the main house. It was a sprawling white edifice with verandas on 2 stories and windows that shone as if under constant observation. To the left, horses grazed in a paddock, while a garden to the right had been cultivated for decades to achieve a look of perfect, artful wildness. I had known this view since I was 12, and it never lost its ability to land like a blow. The persistent feeling that this place was too flawless for someone who was never meant to belong. Matteo's vehicle came to a seamless halt beneath the portico, and before I could draw a breath, he was at my door, opening it with a fluid, practiced motion that suggested deep familiarity. I accepted his hand and emerged, and it was then I saw them assembled on the veranda. Aunt Rosanna was paralyzed, her flute of Prosecco suspended midair, her gaze flickering between me and Matteo in a silent, frantic spiral. Beside her, Aunt Bettina gripped Cousin Lara's shoulder as if for balance, while Lara's jaw was slack with an expression of such profound disbelief that, on any other day, I would have found it magnificent. A silent trial unfolded in the span of 6 seconds, a beat heavy with consequence. The newcomer, Matteo, then made his move, his hand settling in the small of her back with a firm, proprietary pressure. The gesture, entirely unbidden, was a silent broadcast. She is with me. She felt a shock of heat surge through her, a visceral response she knew was compromising her clarity. A voice which she recognized by its tone as Ginevra's cut through the suspended moment from within the house, just as she was about to act. Ginevra Ferrante was framed in the doorway, her expression a wide, ravenous smile, a victory lap, all on its own. She moved in for a perfunctory embrace, but her eyes immediately slid past Serena to give Matteo a brazen appraisal. Her verbal strike, "And you have brought an escort," was saturated with unspoken meaning. Her own reply came out flat and devoid of emotion. Matteo then introduced himself with a starkness that held no trace of deference. This outright refusal to engage in the social ritual and bend to the hierarchy caused Ginevra's smile to falter by a millimeter, a minute signal that her authority had just met an unexpected challenge. You have to understand, for Ginevra, this dinner was pure theater, and she was its star. The lighting was deliberately low, painting everyone in the dramatic, dangerous shades of a film noir. And caught in this manufactured scene was Serena, wedged between her hired companion, Matteo, and her prying Aunt Rosanna, whose interrogation began instantly. Rosanna fired the first shot. "So where did you two meet?" A clear attempt to find a crack in their story. Serena's defense was 2 words of solid ice. "At work." The phrase landed with the finality of a closing door, killing the conversation dead. A heavy silence fell as Rosanna waited for a vulnerability that Serena refused to reveal. The aunt then turned her attention to Matteo, who met her questions with a politeness so impenetrable it served as a wall. From across the table, the ex, Connor Reeds, allowed his mask of indifference to slip just for a moment. Up close, his composure was fragile. Serena, meanwhile, simply felt an empty quiet where the ache used to live. The space in her soul once reserved for Connor had become a cold, dark void. Still, his stare bored into her from across the table, heavy and demanding. It was then Matteo leaned in, his voice a low hum in her ear, delivering a surgically precise diagnosis. "He lacks the focus of a groom." The observation struck a nerve. Serena remained silent, but a deep blush betrayed her as she hid behind her wine glass. Her eyes met Matteo's for 3 seconds too long before he disengaged with practiced detachment. Then, the patriarch, Augusto Ferrante, made his entrance, a calculated arrival meant to command the room and steal its oxygen. As he moved through the pleasantries, his gaze fell upon Matteo for no more than 2 seconds. There was no surprise in his eyes, only cold assessment, instantly identifying Matteo as an unknown, a potential risk. He then turned to Serena, offering a flawless, hollow smile that was nothing more than familial duty. "Uncle Augusto," Serena replied, her tone a perfect mirror of his own detached control. He all but ignored Matteo, so Serena's attention shifted to Matteo's face, a study in neutrality, a blankness that spoke volumes. The dinner devolved into a tedious performance of old anecdotes and forced laughter. Augusto feigned a need for more wine, a flimsy excuse to retreat to the cellar. Serena saw Matteo's gaze follow him, a movement so swift it was almost imagined. The look was so fleeting, she questioned if she had seen it at all. Inventing an excuse of her own, she found them in a dim hallway. Augusto was pressing Matteo with what seemed like casual inquiries about business, but it was the questioning of a predator testing the bars of a cage. Matteo was an immovable object, conceding nothing. The air was thick with unspoken threats. Augusto finally withdrew, defeated. Then Matteo turned, and his gaze locked with hers. He knew she had witnessed it all. His expression was a perfect mask of calm, revealing nothing. Yet that single look was a confirmation. The terms of their agreement had fundamentally shifted. Serena broke eye contact first, returning to her seat. For the remainder of the meal, she felt his gaze on her, a persistent pressure she couldn't decide if she welcomed or resented. Later in their room, she tried to reassert control. "You take the bed," she announced. "I will sleep on the sofa." Matteo entered, his eyes sweeping the room with the tactical precision of a soldier. His response was a single, unyielding word. "No." He then clarified, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No, the bed is yours," as he began to inspect the closet. Every protest Serena had prepared died in her throat. Her friend Isla would later label this protagonist syndrome, a clear violation of their contract. Serena tried to remind herself, he is an employee. Employees do not sleep on the sofa. Ila's voice countered over the phone. Serena ended the call, unwilling to confront the implications. Life at the estate was a meticulously staged performance of leisure. Matteo played his role flawlessly, navigating her family with a polished charm that was both disarming and utterly opaque, deflecting their questions before they could fully form. He could stake a claim on her in a crowded room without ever touching her. On the second day, the family arranged a horseback ride for the couples, their signature method of transforming recreation into a contest. She rode beside Matteo through the orange groves in a tense silence. He finally broke it, nodding toward a distant fence. "That fence has a compromised third post from the left." She looked. He was correct. "Are you familiar with farms?" she asked. "Properties," he corrected, his one-word building a fortress. "Is there a real difference?" A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Marginally. That single word, marginally, echoed in her mind for the rest of the ride. Her friend Esla, predictably, continued to press. "Fine. But are you having actual conversations?" "On occasion," Serena conceded. "What does that mean, Serena?" "You know what I'm really asking." She did. She buried her phone in a drawer and stared at the ceiling for 10 long minutes. An unforeseen variable had entered the equation. It was in the small things, the way he observed her like an analyst, not a guardian. The black coffee he had brought her that first morning, a preference she had never shared. It was his hand, resting on her arm for a brief moment to guide her past Aunt Bettina in the corridor. It lasted only 2 seconds, his fingers just brushing her elbow, gone before she could fully process the contact, but her skin remembered. Her self-diagnosis was chillingly simple. She was compromised. She knew it with an absolute and terrifying certainty. Then, on the third afternoon, Connor found her. She was staring blankly at the same page of a book when he materialized with 2 lemonades and a smile that had once undone her. Now it was just a melody she had heard too many times. "May I join you?" he asked, already claiming the chair beside her. "You are," she answered flatly, her eyes still on the book. He set a glass down, delivering a well-rehearsed line. "You look well." "Thank you." "It's an observation, not a compliment," he clarified, adding, "You seem different." "I am." She turned the unread page. He leaned closer. "Who is he, Serena?" "My boyfriend," she replied, her tone as neutral as a weather forecast. A beat of silence. "You never mentioned a relationship." "You never asked." She snapped her book shut and met his gaze directly. A staggering sense of liberation washed over her as she realized his presence now stirred nothing in her but a deep sense of fatigue. "And even if you had asked, Connor, your wedding is tomorrow. What material difference could it have possibly made?" He had no response. He simply stared out at the garden before rising and walking away. Only after he was gone did she see Matteo standing in the doorway. Arms crossed, face unreadable, he had watched the entire exchange. He made no mention of the confrontation. He simply crossed the space, took the chair Connor had just vacated, and gestured to the untouched drink. "Lemonade?" Serena glanced at the glass. "It is disposable." A faint smirk touched Matteo's lips. "I assumed as much." The third night was oppressively hot. She lay staring at the ceiling. He was on the couch, reading. The silence between them was a tangible thing. "Is this your natural state?" she asked into the darkness. A pause. "Clarify the state." "This quiet. This lack of need to fill the void." She heard the soft sound of his book closing. "Most people talk to avoid thinking," he said. "I do the opposite." She turned her head to look at him. He was stretched out on the sofa, which was far too small for him, staring at the ceiling just as she was. The sight of this powerful, composed man looking so displaced on that piece of furniture stirred something sharp and unwelcome inside her. "You are not required to sleep there," she said, mainly to silence the thought. He turned his head, their gazes catching and holding for a fraction too long. "I am aware," he replied, before turning his eyes back to the ceiling, perfectly still. She watched him for an eternity before forcing herself to look away as the tension in the room continued to mount. The near miss on the veranda the following day was entirely a product of the atmosphere. The family's loud chatter had driven her upstairs in search of a sweater she did not need, a simple excuse to evade Aunt Rosanna. Matteo materialized behind her as if from nowhere. When she turned in the hall, he was simply there, far too close. The corridor was narrow, and the afternoon sun streamed through the window, charging the air. He made no move to step back, neither did she. They remained frozen in that small, sunlit space for a lifetime. The space between them vibrated with an unmade choice. His gaze held hers, systematically undoing her composure, and she was beginning to despise it. Then, predictably, footsteps from the staircase broke the moment. She drew back. He paused, assessing the interruption before he simply left, leaving the question hanging in the air. Downstairs, sweater in hand, for no reason, she stared blankly at the game. Aunt Rosanna was dissecting the play. Ginevra and Connor shared a laugh. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, entirely indifferent to her silent collapse. Much later, lying awake as Matteo slept, she finally confronted the feeling. For 3 hours, she had resented her aunts for appearing when they did. And in a room upstairs, Matteo Romano was also greeting the dawn, keeping a solitary watch of which she was completely unaware. A single day remained before the wedding, and the entire scheme was already a disaster. The Ferrante house thrummed with what the family called excitement, but it felt like 100% stress. Amidst the overwhelming tide of flowers and caterers, her aunts were forces of nature. She retreated to the library. It was a neglected sanctuary of dust and decaying wood, her only haven for 2 days, and all she needed was 15 minutes of peace. She needed a respite from the constant hollow inquiries into her well-being, delivered in a tone that confirmed she was anything but. The door opened without a knock. Connor Reed entered, wearing his most tragic expression, and closed the door behind him with a gentleness that felt like a threat. "I had to speak with you alone," he began. "And I needed not to speak," she countered, her gaze fixed on the garden. "I suppose one of us is destined for disappointment." He crossed to the window, invading her space to press his point. "Serena!" His voice was a low hum of practiced regret. "I've made a mistake, with us, with all of this. And I have no right to say this on the eve of my wedding. But if I don't speak now, I will actually marry her." She at last turned to meet his gaze. "You wed my cousin at dawn, Connor. That story ended long ago." His eyes widened, searching for a familiar pain and finding only healed-over flesh. "I'm still in love with you," he pleaded, a confession that would have undone her once. But now she felt only a void, the ghost of an old wound where the ache had finally faded. There was no rage, no agony to match his desperate performance. All she felt was a cold, piercing clarity that arrives when you finally stop deceiving yourself. "You don't love me," she stated, her tone as level as if correcting a simple error. "You're terrified of marriage, and I am your last-minute escape plan. That isn't love." His mouth fell open, then shut. "You need to leave, Connor." She turned back to the window, her decision to witness the union now solidified. She heard his departure, the latch clicking shut, severing the final thread to her past. The space he vacated was not empty. It was filled with a far more significant presence, the man in the dark suit who had observed it all from the couch, a detail she remained unaware of. The previous night's dinner was an atmosphere of flickering candles, untouched food, and hollow pleasantries. For these occasions, she wore a burgundy gown, a dress that projected quiet confidence but demanded a second look. As she descended the stairs, Matteo's only acknowledgement was to halt his conversation with Raphael, the enigmatic newcomer, and simply pause for one profound, telling moment. She seared that single moment into her mind. At dinner, Matteo sat beside her as arranged, while the familiar performance unfolded. Aunt Rosanna attempted small talk, Augusto observed everyone with predator-like focus, and Ginevra was a beacon of light, poised for her leading role. Connor was positioned directly opposite her. He watched her with a raw intensity he no longer bothered to conceal. Matteo saw it. She knew he did, because his stillness shifted. It was no longer the quiet appreciation from before, but the heavy, charged silence that precedes an intervention. He then angled his body toward her. The gesture was so deliberate she felt his approach before he made contact. His shoulder, his arm, then his lips beside her ear. The closeness short-circuited her thoughts. "Look at me," he commanded in a murmur meant only for her. She turned her head, and the space between them collapsed. The entire charade of the professional bodyguard was over. There was only his face, his dark eyes betraying nothing as the sounds of the dinner party faded into oblivion. He lifted a hand to her face, his purpose undeniable, his fingers brushing her chin just before he kissed her. This was no hesitant public display for the onlookers. It was a measured, slow-burning fire that bypassed all her defenses and struck a vulnerability she hadn't known existed. The conversation around the table faltered in a wave of disbelief, but it was irrelevant. There was a hand cupping her jaw, his mouth on hers, and an ember igniting in her chest that had no right to be there. Yet it burned with an impossible heat. He drew back with that same unnerving control, leaving her gazing at him before she surveyed the room to find Connor's seat vacant. No one was even watching the exit. He had already vanished. The others were simply staring at them. The ants appeared to have forgotten how to breathe. Augusto's eyes were fixed on Matteo, his expression a cipher she would decode later. Ginevra's radiant smile had tightened at the edges. Then, with a composure that felt like a calculated strike, Matteo merely raised his wine glass and took a sip, as if he hadn't just detonated the entire evening. She went to her room before dessert, offering him no words. There was nothing to say, or perhaps too much, which amounted to the same thing. She closed their bedroom door, sat on the bed, and stared at her hands, struggling to find order in the chaos. The kiss was a tactic to make Connor retreat, a strategic maneuver, part of his duties. This was the rational explanation. The issue was that her body was screaming. It was real, an argument her mind was losing. It was also the most seismic kiss she'd experienced in years, presenting a problem she had no answer for that night. A knock sounded 20 minutes later, 3 distinct taps. She opened the door. It was Matteo, his jacket gone, the top button of his shirt undone. The alteration was minor, but he seemed just as formidable, now with one less piece of armor. They regarded one another for a heavy moment, the air charged with warmth and unspoken thoughts before she moved aside. He entered, and she secured the door behind him. When she faced him again, he stood far too near for any pretense to survive. "The kiss was not part of the contract," she managed, her voice less steady than she'd hoped. "It was not," he conceded. "Then you were out of bounds." "Perhaps." He yielded no ground with the admission, and she held hers. A volatile energy arced between them, not merely desire, nor just conflict, but a fusion of both in a space far too confined to contain it. "You kissed me before everyone," she stated, the words both an indictment and a query. "Yes." His voice was a deep, resonant hum. He inclined his head, a subtle motion that consumed the last of the air between them. "Serena," he murmured, and her name from his lips felt like a deliberate choice, not a mere label, and it landed differently. That was for their benefit. This is for mine. She drew a breath to object. She had a perfectly valid rebuttal prepared, and then his mouth was on hers again, a slow, consuming kiss that rendered her point utterly moot. It was a building heat, their tongues engaging in a silent dialogue of questions and answers. His hand found her waist, sliding beneath her shirt to meet her warm skin. She exhaled against his mouth as her body surrendered to his touch. He carefully pressed her back against the wall, his firm body aligned with hers. She could feel the full extent of his readiness as her fingers undid the buttons on his shirt, liberating the heat from his chest. Her hands explored the contours of his torso down to the edge of his trousers. A sharp breath escaped him when her hand found him, his pulse a frantic rhythm in her palm. With expert grace, he raised her skirt, his fingers locating her core. They entered her with a slow, devastating precision while his thumb moved in lazy, perfect circles. A tremor seized her, stealing her breath as her hands gripped his shoulders. And then he lifted her. Her legs instinctively locked around his waist. In one singular, powerful movement, he was inside her, a profound, stretching fullness. Their bodies found a desperate, flawless rhythm. Each thrust propelled them further into the sensation. The pleasure intensified into an overwhelming crest. And when the release came, it was an absolute detonation. She unraveled around him in a series of long, shuddering waves, breathing his name against his skin. He followed an instant later, his own release, a succession of hot, potent spasms, his frame trembling against hers. For a time, the lamplight cast a golden sheen on their slick, intertwined forms. Much later, the warm, quiet night of the estate finally settled around them. Chapter 5. The wedding, the morning, the new reality. She awoke to a high sun, the right side of the bed completely empty and cool, evidence he had been gone some time. She lay there, gazing at the ceiling for a few minutes, suspended in the strange quiet that follows a cataclysm before the mind can process the event. There was no regret. She searched for it, probing the edges of her feelings for its familiar sting. Nothing. Only a faint, thrilling lightness and the lingering scent of him on the other pillow. A secret she would keep for herself, especially from Isla. Matteo was already on the veranda with his coffee, his back to her, observing the staff arranging the final chairs for the ceremony. The sound of her approach made him turn his head in a slow, measured motion. His eyes met hers, and the guarded wall he maintained had vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar calm before he glanced back at the garden. "Coffee is ready," he said. As she sat, they settled into a silence that was entirely new, one devoid of manipulation or strategy. It was simply the quiet between two people in the early hours, a raw reality that felt somehow more intimate than the night before. Noon arrived with the wedding, set beneath the floral arch that had taken hours to construct. Ginevra emerged, her gown an exquisite work of lace, her face illuminated with absolute bliss. Witnessing her procession did not stir envy in our girl, but a detached sense of having evaded a destiny that was never hers. At the altar, Connor resembled a man performing a noble act he could not comprehend. As he took Ginevra's hands, his gaze fell for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression she did not miss. Beside her, Matteo's arm brushed lightly against her own, a quiet acknowledgement. When the marriage was sealed and applause erupted, he whispered, "There, you have survived it." She turned toward him, her gaze sharpening. "I was never the one in peril." "I am aware," he replied, his tranquil voice a study in inscrutability. "The question was whether they would survive you." His words lingered in the air. She had no reply. The music swelled, shattering the delicate moments she stored away in her memory. They departed the reception early, their exit a silent mutual accord. A single look across the room was all the communication needed, and 15 minutes later they were gone. The Ferrante estate diminishing in the rearview mirror. A strange and profound calm settled over the week that followed. They remained in the city. His apartment, with its cavernous ceilings and sparse furnishings, was a landscape of books piled with the chaotic logic of a scholar indifferent to aesthetics. The space was an extension of him, and she found herself exploring it, deciphering him. They attempted to cook a meal together just once. His competence was a quiet, infuriating masterpiece, while she fumbled with a simple onion. He corrected her hold on the knife without a word, his hand enveloping hers for 3 seconds that caused her to ruin the next cut completely. That was on purpose, she accused softly. I was refining your technique, he answered, his voice a perfect deadpan. With your hand, it is the most effective approach. She saw him inspecting the cutting board. His features a careful mask she was learning meant he was hiding a smirk, and she returned to the stove to avoid saying something he could turn against her. Their entire interaction was built on a spoken pact, a deal forged by 2 people convinced it was unbreakable. For the term of the contract and nothing more. No feelings, no entanglements. It was a flawless, mature strategy for 2 intelligent people to emerge unscathed. She found herself questioning that strategy with increasing frequency, a thought she deliberately suppressed. Sometime after she had departed his apartment, the intercom buzzed. Matteo answered the concierge, who announced that 2 gentlemen were downstairs with a delivery from Mr. Ferrante. The tension in the doorman's voice confirmed it was not a cordial visit. Send them up, was Matteo's command. The arrivals were men whose intentions entered the room ahead of them. They paused just inside the threshold, projecting a disciplined stillness, a quiet claim on the space that was its own form of intimidation. The elder of the 2 began to speak. The message was concise, its feigned casualness more menacing than any outright threat. Mr. Augusto Ferrante wished to conclude all matters prior to the Christmas holiday. A financial settlement for the recent unpleasantness was proposed, contingent on a single term. Matteo Romano was to sever all connection with the niece, permanently. When the man concluded, Matteo offered only a profound silence. He stood motionless, hands tucked in his pockets, his expression a complete blank. A void that compels lesser men to speak. This visitor was no lesser man. He waited. Tell Mr. Ferrante, Matteo stated finally, his voice a low-level hum, that the message was received. The courier had clearly anticipated more. Nothing else was offered. Is that all? He inquired, arching a brow. For now, Matteo replied. A flicker of understanding passed between the 2 men before they turned and departed without another word. The click of the lock sealed a new, heavier silence in the room. Matteo moved to the window, his gaze on the city below, not reflective, but strategic. He was processing an internal shift visible only in his deepening stillness. Augusto had just placed Serena on the table like a bargaining chip, invoking her name in a negotiation as if she were mere property. He did so with the nonchalance of a man who had viewed his niece as a movable asset. For so long, he no longer recognized the transgression. Matteo was already aware of the grim history. His own intelligence on the Ferrante family dynamics had outlined her position, or rather her complete lack of one. The outcast niece, daughter of the sister who had failed, a name on a ledger, but never a voice in the room. Yet no dossier on earth could have prepared him for the reality of her. the sheer fortitude she displayed as her world disintegrated, the sharp wit she used as a shield, which felt like the most authentic part of her, the clean, decisive manner in which she cut Connor from her life, not with histrionics, but like closing a shutter against a storm. He had entered that club with an impeccable strategy, every variable accounted for, but somewhere between a bouquet of flowers and a kitchen knife, the logic had held, yet the mission had utterly failed. His phone vibrated. It was Raphael, his ever-present shadow, confirming Augusto's couriers were leaving. 2 departed, no incident. Ferrante is forcing the issue, Matteo typed. I know. We act at dawn. Chapter 6. She was playing too, but it was not a game. Augusto's call came on the morning of Christmas Eve, his tone entirely devoid of the false warmth he performed for the holidays. It was the lower, clipped cadence he used for crisis management, masquerading as a simple conversation. He needed to see me, he said, about a matter of importance regarding my companion. I chose a public cafe for the meeting, a neutral ground, arriving early to let my coffee grow cold as I constructed my defenses. My expression would be a mask, revealing nothing until I understood his play. Augusto entered in his gray overcoat, his punctuality a virtue he wore like an honor, and occupied the chair opposite me, foregoing any greeting. The man you are seeing, he began, as if identifying a disease, is not the person you think he is. I remained silent. Matteo Romano. He let the name hang in the air between us, its weight a calculated weapon. Do you understand what that name signifies? You are about to tell me, I responded. And he did, with the cold precision of a killer briefing a mark, outlining the syndicate, its reach, and its unspoken, lethal reputation. He continued speaking of danger, repeating the phrase, you have no idea what you are involved in, as if repetition could manifest it as truth. As my coffee chilled, I simply listened, my heart settling into a low, heavy rhythm, the pulse of my world tilting off its axis. The man Augusto was describing was not a stranger. In fact, it was the only version that made all the fragmented details I could never piece together finally cohere. The effortless calm that was part of his nature, not a performance. The way a shadow had fallen across my uncle's face at their very first dinner, her reality fractured and reformed in a violent instant. As disparate facts, Raphael's appearances, the men on Christmas Eve, coalesced into a single horrifying image. And still, one memory fought against it. A fragile moment with Romano, a hand over her own, a smile reserved just for her. This tiny ember of warmth waged a war against the cold truth with the fierce denial of a fresh wound. Augusto watched her, anticipating a collapse. After a long moment, her response came, a shard of ice. I know, he blinked. What? He managed. That I have known the entire story. Her gaze was fixed on his, from the very beginning. A fleeting, unguarded shock crossed Augusto's face before he concealed it. Are you telling me you were aware of who he was when— I am telling you, she interjected, her voice a calm, sharp edge, that you have revealed nothing to me that was not already my own affair. He paused, reading her cool facade, knowing it was a lie masking a profound inner turmoil. He shifted slightly in his chair, a telltale sign he was about to alter his tactics. Well now, he said, his voice coated in condescending praise. A clever girl. You deduced it more quickly than I gave you credit for. Then, after a measured pause, he moved in for the strike. Then you will understand my proposition. He detailed his gambit. You will have full authority over Romano and Associates, he explained, total command, a share of the profits, and more autonomy than my own daughters will ever see. He inclined his head. It is everything you desired and everything I deliberately withheld from you, Serena. It was not an apology. It was the twisting of a blade. And the price, she stated flatly, intimately familiar with his games. With him, there was always a cost. You sever all ties with Romano, permanently. Her eyes bored into his before she delivered the final, chilling counter. What is your actual motivation here? He began his prepared response. As I said, Romano is a danger, and you... Cut it out. Her cup met the saucer with a sharp crack. This is not some concerned uncle routine. One phone call on Christmas does not mean you have ever cared about me. She canted her head, adopting his own power posture. What leverage does he hold over you? The silence that stretched between them was a confession louder than any words, a stark confirmation that she was correct. You are asking questions that lead nowhere, Augusto bluffed, all warmth erased from his voice. Or maybe I am asking the only one that truly matters. She rose, took her purse, and gave him a look that conveyed she saw right through him. I will consider your proposal. She left without awaiting a reply, the cold night air striking her like a physical blow. She arrived at Matteo's building with the feeling of sickness coiling in her gut. Her knock, 3 sharp reports, was far more forceful than she had intended. When he opened the door, a single look at her face was all he needed. He simply stepped back, allowing her entry. My uncle just explained who you are, she said, stopping in the center of his living room. I require your account of things. Now. Matteo merely watched her, his typical composure now the stillness of a man bracing for a detonation he himself had set. And then he began to speak. He outlined how Augusto had systematically dismantled his life, contracts that evaporated, suppliers who suddenly vanished, and financial lines rerouted to obliterate 2 years of his efforts. He recited it like a forensic report, devoid of emotion. She absorbed it all, her expression one of someone in physical pain. Then he arrived at the nightclub. I knew who you were the moment you entered, he said, his gaze looking straight through her. I sent the other man away. I took his place because you were the one blind spot he would never see. The silence that followed was suffocating. She rose from a couch she didn't recall sitting on and moved to the window, struggling to reorient herself. Every single shared memory, his greeting, his hand on her waist, was now irredeemably tainted. I was a tool, she whispered to her reflection. That was the objective, he replied, offering no palliative, no attempt to soften the brutal truth. She just stood there, and he knew in that profound stillness that the next move was entirely hers. With her purse in hand, she moved to the door, her fingers brushing the cold brass knob. A violent storm raged inside her, a war between blistering fury and the profound, soul-deep wound carved by Augusto Ferrante over 30 years of quiet degradation. Twice now, he had used her as a piece on his board. He had presented a stolen birthright as if it were a gift. She turned, her movements slow, to meet Matteo's gaze. His silent stare was no comfort, only an unforgiving truth, the one solid thing between them. The vault, she began. It's in his study at this state. Ginevra told me the combination years ago. It's the birth dates of his daughters. The words hung in the space between them. I have a very good idea what's inside, and I know that finding it will utterly ruin him. Her gaze drilled into his. You want vengeance? I want restitution for a life spent as a puppet. She released the doorknob. So, we formulate a strategy. For a bare second, Matteo simply stared, and she witnessed it. Raw, unfeigned surprise, a first for him. Then his lips twisted into a smirk she was only just starting to decipher. Agreed, he conceded, but I need a complete account of his words. As she took a seat, her bag met the sofa, and a sliver of warmth penetrated the bitter Christmas Eve air. They were, at last, allies. Chapter 7. They possessed the objective, the access code, and a holiday gala that had just become their stage for a heist. For the Ferrante affair, she chose a crimson dress, a gift from her mother she'd never had cause to wear. Tonight, it served as her armor. Matteo's gaze, once unsettling, now met hers without flinching. You are prepared, she stated. It was a declaration. I am, she affirmed, her tone more certain than it had been for years. He presented his arm, she accepted. They entered the Ferrante estate for her 12th Christmas celebration there, though this was the first with an agenda. The gathering was the usual spectacle of hollow, familial ties. A towering tree, ambient music, and flawless catering were merely the backdrop for a cast of smiling assassins. Aunts drifted by with flutes of champagne and sharp, critical glances. Ginevra was present with her husband Connor, both glowing with the sheen of a new marriage. Augusto, naturally, was commanding attention in the grand hall, the undisputed center of a circle of old associates. He planted a mechanical kiss on her forehead, his eyes flicking to Matteo for a beat before returning to her, his smile utterly vacant. Serena, how wonderful you could make it. I wouldn't dream of missing it, she returned with equal insincerity, accepting a champagne flute she had no intention of sipping. Just outside, Raphael Conte and 2 associates studied blueprints on a mobile device. Matteo's operation was armed and ready. Raphael was positioned at the rear entrance. A second operative monitored the corridor leading to the study. A third man was stationed in the getaway car, its engine running silently. Her objective? Access the office, open the safe, and retrieve its contents. The strategy was designed for simplicity, to prevent her from succumbing to a full-scale panic. For 40 minutes, she played her role flawlessly. She feigned interest in Aunt Rosanna's catering woes, acknowledged Ginevra's honeymoon anecdotes, and observed Augusto's pompous, self-assured gait, the walk of a man convinced of his own invincibility. For the initial 20 minutes, Matteo's presence was a steadying force. Then, with the grace of a seasoned professional, he integrated himself into Augusto's trusted circle. She understood this was her cue. The diversion was now active. While her uncle's focus was captured by Matteo Romano, her opportunity arrived. Feigning a search for the powder room, she slipped into the hallway. Augusto's study, with its imposing dark wood door, had always been forbidden ground. With a calm hand, she entered and shut the door behind her without a sound. The air in the room was thick with the smell of aging paper, expensive furniture wax, and the lingering ghost of a cigar smoked by a man perpetually in command. A colossal desk held dominion over the space, flanked by towering bookshelves. The safe lay concealed behind a canvas she'd first noticed at age 14. She recalled interrupting him that day, seeing an expression she couldn't interpret then, but which was now painfully clear. She lifted the artwork. Behind it was a compact gray vault with a glowing keypad. A fragment of Ginevra's voice echoed in her mind, an offhand remark that had become the key. My father is a man of routine. Do you realize every password he creates is just his daughter's birthdays? He's so dreadfully predictable. Serena could almost hear her sister's wry laughter. She keyed in Ginevra's birth date. Access denied. With a steadying breath, She entered Lara's. A sharp click broke the stillness as the mechanism disengaged. Within, she found a thick manila envelope, several bound documents, and a small black flash drive. She paused, feeling the gravity of a history that began long before her birth. Then she took the items and secured the vault. At that precise instant, she detected footsteps. They were not the wandering steps of a guest. They moved with grim purpose. There was no chance to replace the painting. Augusto materialized in the doorway, and his expression validated the dread she'd felt all evening. His actions were cold and methodical. He locked the door, his eyes took in the exposed wall, and then he glanced at her purse. Only then did he access a desk drawer and retrieve a compact handgun, moving with the efficiency of a man who was ready, not startled. "Serena." His voice was utterly level, a quality far more chilling than any rage. "Uncle Augusto," she answered, her own tone a perfect reflection of his. "You cannot possibly comprehend what you've involved yourself in," he said, offering a final, patronizing chance for retreat. "I am fully aware of my actions," she retorted, her voice firm against the surge of adrenaline inside her. "You are defending a man who manipulates you." He advanced one slow, measured step. "He entered your life for his own gain and will discard you when he is finished." "Or," she countered, refusing to yield, "I am finally confronting you, something that is long past due." And in that moment, Augusto's famed composure finally fractured. She was the single variable he had never considered. For a fraction of a second, the formidable patriarch vanished, replaced by a man realizing he had committed a ruinous error in underestimating his forgotten niece. And it was far too late. He brought the gun up, and time itself seemed to distort. The world sharpened. The glow of the lamp, the haze of cigar smoke, the muffled sounds of the party. This was the end game. Her against her uncle, 30 years of being rendered insignificant, converging on this one final violent point of reckoning. And then the doorframe shattered. Matteo Romano strode in, flanked by two men who were clearly not party guests. Down the hall, Rafael Conte lowered his device, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. The game was won. Augusto stood paralyzed, weapon raised, but his mind unable to process the new reality. He had been perfectly checkmated. Matteo simply moved to stand between them, a living barricade that silently dared him to act. He paid the gun no mind. His gaze was fixed on Augusto, projecting a tranquility that was the ultimate display of dominance. "You are already aware of who I am," Matteo said, his voice quiet but absolute. "And you know the contents of her bag, should you do something foolish." Augusto was little more than a statue. "Release the weapon, Augusto." It wasn't a suggestion. It was the story's inevitable conclusion. After 3 beats of heavy silence, the handgun clattered onto the hardwood floor. Matteo's stance remained unchanged. There was no relief, only the stark satisfaction of a flawlessly executed plan. He shot her a brief glance, a silent inquiry. She gave a slight nod. She was fine. His attention snapped back to Augusto, his expression now broadcasting a clear message. The debt was due. She leaned back against a bookshelf, finally drawing a full breath as her heart hammered against her ribs. She saw her uncle across the room, diminished, old, and thoroughly defeated. And what she felt was not victory, but the quiet resonance of a chapter closing. In that study, on that evening, Matteo Romano was the conductor of the entire orchestra. a truth Augusto Ferrante understood far too late. This brought them to Chapter 8, the termination of the agreement. Matteo's men restrained Augusto without ceremony, rendering any potential drama obsolete. There was no shouting, no struggle, nothing to disturb the blissfully unaware revelers outside. Her uncle merely sat, bound to his own chair, his mind still trying to reverse engineer his own stunning defeat. Matteo positioned himself before the desk, allowing the quiet to press down before he began to speak. The conditions were presented like an inescapable verdict from which there was no appeal. He stated unequivocally that the documents she held would utterly dismantle Augusto's empire across the various sectors and nations. Every single asset he had acquired in the last 3 years would be returned. Repayment would follow a non-negotiable timeline. For the killing stroke, Augusto Ferrante was forbidden in perpetuity from ever using the Romano name. It was a complete social annihilation. After Matteo delivered his judgment, a profound silence filled the room before her uncle's gaze shifted to her. An entirely new expression moved across his features, so foreign it took her a moment to identify it. It was the look of a grand manipulator watching his entire theater burn to embers around him. She held her tongue. Words were now meaningless, incinerated in the inferno of the last 15 minutes. She clutched the portfolio, her stare a silent vow of his absolute destruction before she pivoted and departed, concluding the scene on her own terms. As Raphael entered to oversee the aftermath, she reached the corridor. Her stride was sure, a confident facade that her trembling knees nearly betrayed, the aftershock of her triumph. Matteo met her moments later near a window that looked out on the garden party, its music and soft lighting belonging to another reality, just 20 meters from the ruin they'd made. They observed it in silence. Then she held out the portfolio. "This belongs to you." He accepted it, his eyes meeting hers. Then from his coat pocket he produced a single sheet, folded 4 times, that she knew on sight. There it lay, their original pact, her signature still stark against the page. He had acquired a controlling interest in her agency a mere 2 days after they had met, a calculated strike to gain possession of her file. She couldn't decide if this new detail should stoke her rage or extinguish it. He offered the document. As she took it, her gaze drifted over her own script, the date, and the cold digits that had once represented her only way out. The paper felt like a relic from a past life, from a time before the rules had been completely rewritten. She tore the contract. A clean, sharp sound of finality, a deeply satisfying conclusion. Clutching the fragments, she saw Matteo produce his own copy, a small detail she mentally filed away. He ripped his with the same detached precision he applied to everything. They stood amidst the wreckage of their agreement, enveloped in a quiet more profound than any they had known. Then a laugh erupted from her, raw and utterly involuntary. It was the sound of a levee breaking. It was a laugh born of pure relief and the sublime absurdity of it all. Standing in a hall decked for Christmas, holding confetti crafted from their shared deceit. Matteo watched her for a moment before he too began to laugh. Not a smirk, but a genuine rolling laugh that seemed to go on forever, reshaping his features in a way she couldn't quite grasp. In that instant, a dreadful, perfect clarity struck her. She was in over her head. The contract had always been nothing more than a flimsy pretense. His laughter subsided first, though his expression remained unguarded, much of his usual armor gone. "You could have walked away," he said, his voice low. "When I let you in, You had what you came for. You could have vanished. I'm aware, she conceded. But you didn't leave. I didn't leave. He observed her with that unnerving stillness, then raised a hand. He carefully tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that felt less like a caress and more like the final ratification of a brand new pact. His hand came to rest on her cheek, and for the first time, the contact felt unscripted. There was no audience, no act, only the corridor, a dark window, and the tattered proof of their old arrangement scattered on the floor. The agreement is settled, he murmured, his tone deepening. It is done, she affirmed. What happens now? He asked. The question was genuine, stripped of his typical confidence. The man who orchestrated every outcome was now ceding control to her. She held his gaze, reading the face she had learned to decipher. Whatever comes next, she said. But this time with no contract. The edge of his mouth curved upward, and she permitted herself a small smile in return. Beyond them, the Ferrante celebration raged on. Rafael Conte was likely delivering some biting remark, and Christmas was unfolding. None of it felt as real as the soft click of a door closing down the hall. Chapter 9. Unforeseen Clauses in the Agreement. 2 months past Christmas, Matteo's apartment had become their apartment, a transition that had occurred without a single discussion. Her existence had simply bled into his. First a toothbrush, then a jacket, then a drawer, and finally half a closet he had cleared as if he had been waiting for her all along. The period following the estate's collapse was not simple. Neither had pretended it would be. On some days, he would withdraw behind fortifications she was learning not to internalize. On others, she was so consumed by her own thoughts that he had to speak her name twice. Arguments would flare from nothing and be resolved 20 minutes later over the true issue, concluding only when one of them made the choice to yield, an act of strength, not surrender. Yet they had their anchors. Coffee prepared perfectly each morning, long hours reading together in silence and hand on her back, a quiet signal that simply said, I am here. One night in February, she posed a question to the darkness. Do you regret how we began? His hand rested on her back, tracing slow, abstract shapes. No, he replied softly. But given another chance, I would have handled it differently. How so? I would have revealed the entire truth to you that night in the club. She pictured it. Matteo Romano, confessing everything to her in that bar. She would have fled. She would have frantically called Isabella and never glanced back. I would not have stayed, she knew with certainty. I know. His hand continued its steady, calming motion. That is precisely why I did not. In the stillness, she finally understood the chasm between acceptance and forgiveness. She had accepted him first, during quiet mornings and overshared books. Forgiveness arrived much later, not as a conscious choice, but as the slow erosion of her anger, leaving space for something authentic to grow. The documents from Augusto's safe were now hidden elsewhere, in a location selected by Raphael that she did not know. Matteo had said the analysis would require time, and she discovered she could release her grip on it, trusting him completely. She banished the thought of the papers, compelling her focus back to the present moment. The tranquility of their apartment, the solid presence of Matteo next to her, was enough to mute the perpetual alarm sounding in her mind. She considered their origins, a cold, strategic arrangement that had somehow warped and reshaped itself into this staggering connection. A straightforward play for power had evolved into a bond neither could truly define, one forged from mutual damage and perilous secrets. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will away the sound that shattered the silence. Matteo's phone vibrated on the nightstand, illuminating the dark with Raphael's name like some dreadful omen, and she mentally swiped it into oblivion. Beside her, Matteo was perfectly still, a silent conspirator in their shared pretense that nothing was happening. She didn't dare check if he was feigning sleep. She couldn't face the reality. Instead, she burrowed deeper into the darkness, desperately trying to reclaim a dream and preserve their flawless, delicate peace. And that marks the conclusion of part 1. For 23 years, her existence had been founded upon a single colossal falsehood concerning her missing mother, a fiction they began feeding her when she was only 7. It took a mere 3 pages to utterly dismantle her world. That file did not just alter her history, it obliterated her very identity. But the cruelest blow was not the deception itself. It was the confirmation in Matteo's gaze that he had known all along and had said nothing. And so the second volume comes to a close. The remainder of this narrative is sealed for now, accessible only to subscribers. For 23 years, she was defined by a poisonous fabrication about her mother, a tale that planted a seed of worthlessness deep within her. The deception began when she was a child of 7, and it wasn't until a 3-page file surfaced that her entire reality was inverted. The words on the page redrew her identity and exposed her family's shadowed history. But the final twisting blade came from Matteo's eyes, a silent admission that he had been complicit. Consider this merely the prelude. You can now access the complete unredacted file. The primary link in the pinned comment will grant you immediate passage to the rest of the story. It is your key to the entirety of the second volume. This investigation is ongoing, and we are releasing new chapters as we unearth more. This archive is where we house the most disturbing psychological explorations. The content is far too raw for a general audience, so this private vault allows us to present everything without restraint. A brief word of warning: our primary channel has been terminated. This new archive serves as our fallback, a bastion to sustain the team so we can press on with these investigations without interruption. We will provide updates on our new infrastructure shortly. For the time being, use the first link in the pinned comment to join us here. It is immensely frustrating that our material is being stolen and illegally distributed, but this remains the sole official source for the story.
Let's be honest, everybody in this story thought they were smart. The ex thought nostalgia could be used like a backup plan. The family thought status would keep everyone in line. The patriarch thought he could move people around like furniture with expensive shoes. Even the mysterious guy came in believing he had the cleanest strategy in the room. And then life did what life does best. It humbled everybody. Because here is the bitter truth. The most painful betrayal was never cheating, lying, or secret agendas. It was the discovery that she had spent years trying to win affection from people who only respected leverage. That is soul-level exhaustion. That is the kind of wound that makes a person mistake survival for strength. She thought she was entering a one-week performance. In reality, she was walking straight into the emotional math that had ruled her entire life. But this is where the story gets cruel in the best possible way. The people trying to use her accidentally forced her into clarity. The fake setup exposed the real loneliness. The family drama exposed the family structure. The revenge plan exposed the hunger underneath it. Suddenly the question was no longer, who betrayed whom? It became, why did she need this room to certify her worth in the first place? That is the killer lesson. A person loses twice when she lets toxic people define both the wound and the cure. She bleeds once when they reject her, then again when she builds her whole comeback around their reaction. But the second she steps off that stage, the game changes. Their silence means less, their opinions shrink. Their power starts looking embarrassingly dependent on her continued participation. So yes, the drama is delicious, the reveals are sharp, the irony is chef's kiss. But the real emotional fatality is this: the only way she could finally win was by refusing to keep playing for the audience that enjoyed her pain. That is not just character development, that is liberation.